And here I try to actually to connect myself to the theme of this conference on global war, global connections, and global moments. And I build, of course, on the literature and the history of empires that tried actually to expand the periodization of the First World War. And the second point that I'm making actually is directly related to my own presentation. For the hundreds of thousands of humanitarians, and I'm thinking about doctors, nurses, helpers, ICRC delegates, cooks working in refugee camps, or captains of boats repatriating prisoners of war, those people who assisted military and civilians, men, women, and children in Europe, the Near East, and beyond, the official dates of an armistice or a peace treaty had less of a striking meaning than what we might think. And of course, this is what I'm implying with this title, An Endless War, and I'm provoking this with this title, precisely because the consequences of warfare, as well revolutions, regional conflicts over the peace settlements in Central and Eastern Europe, famine and epidemics, lasted for many months and years after the official end of the hostilities. So to make this point, I present the stories of two women I'm working on, and I give you kind of moving snapshots of their lives. So the first woman is Ruth Parmely, who was actually an American missionary doctor, and the second woman I will talk about is Suzanne Ferrière, who was a Swiss humanitarian. Just to give you a little bit of the context of this presentation, this is a presentation that belongs to my second book project, and the title, as Konstantinos mentioned, is Rebirth in Humanity, A Gender History of Protestant Humanitarian Aid, 1900-1950s. So my main question here is to understand what it meant for a woman engaged in humanitarianism and missionary work to rebirth humanity at the beginning of the 20th century. And the way in which I understand my question is in two ways. First, I actually look at humanitarian practices, daily practices of humanitarianism in terms of medical help, in terms of provision of relief, and in terms of practices of writing and filing at the headquarters of organizations. And the second point that I'm making with the book, but I'm not talking about this today, is that I'm interested in the theology of humanitarianism and in the theology of international humanitarian organizations. In this case, Protestant humanitarian organizations belonging to different states. So in addition to Parmely and Ferrière that I will tell you about, I also work on a British Quaker. So I basically put together side by side and I compare three different national settings in looking at humanitarianism. So for those of you who are not familiar with the history of humanitarianism, it's a fairly recent field. It has more or less 20 years, so it's kind of expanding and there's more and more work done on this topic. So in a nutshell, to give you a sense of the field, it first started with histories written by insiders of international organizations, for instance, historians working for the International Committee of the Red Cross and writing the history from the inside. Then the history of humanitarianism went transnational. There were historians looking at the history of international organizations, mostly from the top-down approach. And now there's a new generation of historians coming, for instance, from the history of medicine, of the history of gender, or area studies that try actually to complicate this story, having more of a social history approach and looking at actors more than institutions, and possibly at recipients of humanitarian aid. So this is the first humanitarian I'm telling you about. So her name was Ruth Parmely. She was an American missionary doctor, born in 1885, and she passed away in 1973, so she had a very long life. She came from a missionary family herself, and she was actually mainly active in Anatolia and Greece, providing medical relief to Armenian women and children who survived the Armenian genocide. So this picture was actually taken in her hut, where she was based in central Anatolia in 1921. She was charged with women's kind of medical work for women and children, and she's carrying actually 5 newborn babies, so 3 couples of twins. It means that one of the twins of a couple passed away, and as you can see also from the faces of the babies, their own birth was pretty difficult because what their mothers' experiences was actually a very driving human experience. They were deported in the Anatolian plateau, so they had a very difficult kind of a life before giving birth to these children. Um, so Parmalee was a woman, and she was a doctor, and she was hired as a lady doctor to work just with women in this American mission in Harput. So she was hired on the basis of her gender and on the basis of her profession, and partially also on the basis of her family's background, because as I just mentioned, she came from a missionary family. What happened is that she went to Harput in June 1914, and that was a couple of months before the First World War started, and a year before the beginning of the Armenian genocide. This meant actually that her medical work changed drastically from before to afterwards. So she stayed in Harput until 1917. When the United States entered the war, she had to go back to the United States, and after the signing of the treaties of Mudros, she came back again. And at that point, she was actually wearing different hats, and that was pretty common at that point. She was working for the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. That was the major American missionary organization. She was working for the Near East Relief, a completely new American humanitarian organization, while working for the American Women's Hospital. That was a newly created female medical American organization. Parmalee, here we are in 1921, she had political rights in the States, meaning that she was aware she could vote. And this makes a huge difference when comparing her with Suzanne Ferrier, coming from a Swiss setting where women had the votes at the federal level in 1971. So she couldn't vote actually until the 50s because she always lived abroad, but at least she had the opportunity and the right to vote at that point. So what I'm trying to tell you with this story is that, so I try actually to look at medical practices on a daily basis, and in doing so, I'm moving a little bit away from the historiography now of humanitarianism, which looks more at questions of modernity, for instance. So there's Bruno Caban and Keith Wothenpope, both argue about kind of the modernity of humanitarianism after the end of the war. And actually, by looking at daily medical practices, I try to show more continuities and ruptures from wartime to post-war. And in doing so, what for me is most striking with Parmalee is that she actually helped in medicalization of childbirth and women's health. So she actually brought, at that point, to the Ottoman Empire, new technique for treating syphilis and gonorrhea, and those sexually transmitted diseases were actually present in Armenian women because of what they experienced during the genocide in terms of sexual violence and rape. And this is something also I'm trying to understand, and I still don't have the answer. There were new techniques at that point in medicine for detecting syphilis, such as the Wassermann test. So that was a new test created in the States in 1906. So I guess that there was some sort of experimentation going on in the Ottoman lands, and I'm trying to understand if what Parmalee understood by treating Armenian women then as a knowledge was transferred back to the United States, for instance. So as I said, I see more continuities and ruptures in international humanitarianism while looking at the life and work of Parmalee. So the second woman I'm telling you about is Suzanne Ferrier. She was a Swiss humanitarian, and more or less she lived around the same years as Parmalee, so that's why I also can compare these two lives. This picture of her was taken in 1924, I guess in Santiago de Chile, and the reason why she was in Santiago de Chile was that she was a delegate for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and she was actually moving from one country to another and talking to the Red Cross societies at that point to ally these societies with the International Committee. So Ferrier belonged to an aristocratic liberal Geneva family. She volunteered for the Red Cross. She was never paid. She never received a salary, and this is a huge difference with Parmalee because her medical work was her profession. And by joining the International Committee of the Red Cross, she joined the family business, essentially because she started working for the International Committee in 1915, and she worked for the International Agency for Prisoners of War, and I guess Daniel will tell you more about that. And the reason why she joined that is because her uncle Frédéric Ferrière was the founder of the agency. So that's why I'm talking about family business. What is also very interesting about Ferrière is that from 1914 to the 1950s, she was actually very active for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She was one of the persons who was part of the committee of the organization, and the committee was the central decision-making body at that point. And what is striking to me is that her legacy, the legacy of her work, is completely forgotten in the archives itself, in the organization, and in the literature. So I ask myself why. Why don't we know anything about her? The explanation lies in two answers. First is the male, patriarchal, and misogynist approach of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And just to give you an example of that, there were new propaganda movies created at the beginning of the 20s. And in one of the movies, you see Gustave Ador, at that point, the president of the organization, just smashing his hands on the table. And so those propaganda movies were done in order to have support and collect money for the organization. And by smashing his hands, he tried actually to convey the male strength and power. And if Ferrière is forgotten, is also because the delegates of the organization, who were all men, were those portrayed in propaganda movies, in pictures, in documents, and in pamphlets. And the other reason is that methodologically working on women is also very complicated. So working on Ferrière at the archives of the Red Cross has been quite of a challenge to find her in the different committees. There are no private papers. The family says that the papers do not exist. So I had actually to find a different methodology in order to try to reconstruct her story. And as in the case for Carmelie, when I told you that she was actually active for 3 organizations at the same time, Ferrière was, at the end of the war, she was active for the Red Cross. She was working for the Union Internationale des Secours aux Enfants. That was one of the other big new humanitarian organizations created at that point. And she was also one of the founding members of the International Migration Service, an organization actually dealing with international adoption and family reunification. So she was actually the link somehow connecting the International Committee to minor organizations, and she was present in many committees, commissions at the League of Nations. So she did a lot, and for her, the post-war period was even busier than wartime. So to conclude, I actually, with this new research that I'm finishing up, I look actually at global, transnational, and cosmopolitan lives to analyze and localize different forms of internationalism and humanitarianism from a social anthropological perspective. There were many aspects in common between Ferrière and Carmelie. There were women interested in helping people in need. They were Protestants, and they came from the middle-class aristocratic families. But there were also differences, and I also tried to work with their differences. So they were raised, socialized in different national, cultural, social, and religious settings. And what is more important here is that they were humanitarians in different ways. Carmelie was a humanitarian by providing medical relief and working on the ground with women and children, whereas Ferrière was a humanitarian by meaning of her work, going to committees and writing reports, filing. So we're talking about different ways of humanitarianism. And this is not something I mentioned a lot during my presentation, but of course I intersect gender again with profession, with class, with religion. And somehow these women were also actors of their times, meaning that they had, most of them, an imperial, neo-colonial understanding of humanitarianism. So to go back to the theme of this conference, ordinary men and women and those who tried to assist them carried the war within them for long years. They experienced an endless war where the boundaries of war and peace were blurry and contested. Thank you.